Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Akil, Vohra. I'm the Executive Director of Asian American Lead. We're excited to bring to you this panel entitled A Conversation with Local School Officials on the AAPI Community. There are many issues facing our AAPI youth, and having a better sense of these issues, along with policies and interventions to better aid our population, will be critical as we navigate the pandemic, but also lay a course for equipping all students with the tools they need to find success. I'm thrilled to be welcoming our panelists to our discussion today. Dr. Melissa Kim, Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools, Abrar Omeish-At-Large member of the Fairfax County School Board, Elaine Chang, Director of Partnerships Unit at Montgomery County Public Schools, and Darwin Wong, Coordinator of the Equity Initiatives Unit at Montgomery County Public Schools. Let me hand it over to Dr. Melissa Kim to say a few words of welcome and a little bit of background about yourself.
Hi, hello. Great to be here today and love to see a panel full of Asian American leaders in the public education sector. This is really very unique, unusual to say the least, and really inspiring. So really excited for you all hosting this conversation. My name is Melissa Kim. I am a DCPS educator. I've been in the DC sector for the last 25 plus years. In my role as the current Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools, I support all of our 117 schools and their programs and all of our offerings, both support as well as enrichment, and really excited to have a conversation focused on AAPI community in the region, and excited to share this space with leaders from other school districts.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Abrar?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to, echoing a lot of what Ms. Kim shared, really a pleasure to join you all for a critical conversation today, especially this year. So I'm Abrar Omeish. I serve as an at-large member on the Fairfax County School Board, where we serve almost 1.2 million constituents, manage a $3 billion budget, and serve nearly 180,000 students in 200 locations. My journey in this started as a student rep on the Advanced Academics Advisory Committee to the school board, and then grew into obviously what now is serving on a broader level. We've done some. I was the board liaison to the Minority Student Achievement Oversight Committee, the Title I Advisory Committee, and other committees that have prioritized equity, which I know is one of those themes that we're going to be talking about later on. But it really is just an honor and pleasure to be amongst like-minded Asian American folks who are looking forward to advancing our kids.
Thanks, Abrar. Appreciate it. Elaine?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, and I am so honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues. My name is Elaine Chang, and I'm a former teacher and an assistant principal, former principal in Montgomery County Schools. K-12, I attended the whole school system. I did not speak English in kindergarten. There are definitely reasons why I became a teacher. I'm very proud to be an Asian educator in the United States, very proud to have become a principal. Now I'm the director of the partnerships unit, so I have always dabbled in creating partnerships for the good of the whole, and now I get to do that district-wide with nonprofit, government, business, community organizations, higher ed. I do as much as I can, as fast as I can on behalf of the students, 145,000 students in our school system. Thank you for having me on this panel.
Thanks for joining us. Darwin?
Good morning, everyone. And, just to echo the sentiments here, very, very grateful to have this opportunity. Similar to, many of you here, I am just heartened to see so many Asian American leaders. I am a first generation immigrant. My family immigrated from Hong Kong. I was an ESOL student, and also my family qualified for free and reduced meals. And I am proud to say I'm an MCPS graduate. We lived in the Kennedy cluster, and it's just really an honor and a privilege to serve in the community in which I grew up in. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation and to learn and work with so many partners within the area.
Thanks, Darwin. Excited to have you. Let's jump right into it. Dr. Kim, I'll start with you first. According to the New York Times, this past March, more than 60% of Asian American elementary and middle school students nationwide continued full-time remote learning, compared to only 20% of white students. How are school districts prioritizing the needs of the AAPI community as it relates to return to school? And what have you found to be most particularly effective in our area?
So part of this particular pandemic and what we did to welcome all of our students back is to make sure all of our schools had community reopening conversations. So at the minimum, every one of our school communities, it's not something a district could do. We create the space for all of our school leaders to have at a minimum 3 community-wide conversations so they can think about and talk about opening the table wider, to have people talk and express their fears and hopes, what their students, what was working for them in the virtual space, what they were looking for differently in the in-person space. And by getting people talking and inviting everyone to give a voice to kind of talk about their fears as well as what their hopes were, they were able to build back the reopening plan, which was unique for every one of our schools, that hopefully highlighted the many voices of not only the families, but the students. And we asked our school leaders, and certainly they believed it so, to actually go after the families that weren't coming in, coming in to have those conversations and target, be specific and strategic in targeting more voices to the table so that each community, whoever they were reflecting, really got to own and uplift that conversation, which I think was a really strong and necessary bridge to get to this point where all of our students are back. Our rates of transmission are super, super low. And it hasn't happened without many bumps and many trials. Right before I got to this, I was leading a student budget roundtable, hearing from our as they talk about this particular year, and their words describing the year ranged from really hopeful and exciting to constantly changing, interesting, and sometimes tiresome. So I think managing the range of emotions as well as the reality of our students and parents face, and then give them multiple opportunities to give us feedback on that, I think was critical.
The data in MCPS is actually higher. 75% of Asian families opted for remote learning. But when you look at the trends, 68% for African-American families, 65% for Hispanic families, and white families, 48%. So when you look at what are the underlying reasons for such a high discrepancy? Why are our Asian American communities not opting for in-person? And the research shows that there are really 2 compelling reasons. One is the AAPI community. We are the largest group with multi-generational families living in the same household. So a lot of it is really fear of the COVID exposure. But the second thing is really we've been scapegoated. I mean, that's just and erroneously associated with the COVID-19 virus, starting with the president making strong language. So a lot of families don't feel psychologically or physically safe in schools. And that's really one of the causes for them to opt out of in-person. So what MCPS has tried our best in mitigating and ensuring, to what Dr. Kim brought up, sense of belonging. How do we create a sense of belonging so people, our AAPI folks, feel safe and welcome? So the Equity Initiatives Unit, we put out a newsletter that focuses on stopping AAPI hate. And this newsletter came out right after the reprehensible Atlanta shooting. And there were a couple of goals for this newsletter. We want to really truly highlight the current hysteria and the hate against AAPI during this difficult time. But in addition, we wanted to provide resources for educators so that they could proactively and appropriately intervene in the classrooms. Also, we want to highlight that this oppression and racism facing the AAPI community isn't endemic to just or relegated to just MCPS. It is centuries long, and it is happening across the nation at large. So we really want to elevate that. And in a way, we also wanted to highlight and combat this perpetual foreigner myth that we are part of the core of this great American experiment. We have been here for centuries, and we are also fighting for civil rights. So most importantly, it creates hopefully a sense of belonging and humanizes the AAPI community so that they, once again, feel that their voices are heard, they have the psychological safety. And some of the impacts, real quick, is we have used and extracted some of the resources in providing professional learning in other schools to better serve our AAPI community.
The other really big component was language access. So in the time between transitioning to virtual and then going from virtual back to in person, or having hybrid and all of the in between that went down the past year or more, we found that families didn't necessarily know how to navigate what was going on or to understand even what their options were, to indicate that in surveys that we had put out. So that, ballooned and hopefully will continue. So we have, the third largest language spoken in amongst our families is Korean, and Vietnamese comes shortly after that. And then there's Urdu and Hindi. So some of our Asian languages are actually, a major subset of our community and the top 10 languages spoken in our county. So we expanded, we had tech helplines that were in those languages. We've been offering translations in 24 languages, many of which are, Asian languages. We've also offered parent liaisons. We've, been putting them especially to use during this time. And we have one specifically for the Korean and Vietnamese communities, which tend to be larger in this area. I can go on. There was a launch of this really cool podcast idea. We have one that's in Korean right now that's going for families, to explain what information's out there, how to access. We've done these weekly getting to know FCPS specifically for Asian families and trying to have these sessions be hosted for affinity groups and communities that we can access differently, when we think about it through community networks and again, affinity, as opposed to just broad-based outreach that school systems generally do. And there was, the institution of this new Korean early literacy program too, to try to anticipate what some of those gaps are going to be in advance of what's coming for our youngest learners who, had some difficulty with access throughout this time. So, again, I can really go on, but different communities have experienced this differently. And I think for the AAPI community in particular, the wave of hate that had to be addressed really directly and clearly. And then, of course, language and language access, and then more broadly, academic and mental health support for all our students and families was a priority in FCPS.
Yeah. Can you discuss the role of data and more specifically disaggregated data? So it's not just Asian, but more detailed subgroups, Asian Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese, et cetera. And what role is that data taking? How is that data being collected and utilized in school districts? And how is that helping develop your policies and practices?
Yeah, you poked, you definitely triggered me with a passion of mine here, because this is, let me just say it loud and clear right now. The way we collect data today is not serving our students well. It doesn't give us the proper information to best understand where the problems are, where the gaps are, to be able to address the problem. So if we can't even name it and label it properly, how are we supposed to put all these resources behind programs to address it and actually fix it? And I mean that in a broader sense. So obviously, there's beauty to the solidarity that comes with the broad AAPI umbrella, but at the same time, it's almost like going back to dehumanizing. It's almost offensive that the entirety of Asia and anyone who has any connection to it is considered to be this one thing, right? So in just Fairfax, and I'm going to name them just to show how egregious this is. If we look at just the languages spoken, amongst top 20 languages: Bengali, Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Punjabi, Tagalog, Tamil, Urdu, Vietnamese. I can go on, right? But all these languages that indicate, to me, roots and heritage and unique experiences and stories that I'm sure are vast within these groups, let alone across these groups, right? That would give us more insight into how we can best serve these families. But really, when as a school board, we sit there and look at the data or sort through, thinking about how we're going to do programming, what we see is Black, Hispanic, Asian, white, Native, other. Right? Oh, no, we don't even have other, Native, and that's it. So it continues to be a challenge. Of course, that's specifically on the racial dynamic, but if we think about other things too, if we were to have collected data on the socioeconomic background, and of course it's sensitive and there are all the legal considerations in the world to think about, but But still, I mean, if we were able to think about, how much schooling kids had in the, or was in the home, or, different data points related to a kid's, what resources may be available to a child, that would also help us better target kids who are predictably going to potentially fall behind or have particular needs for us to address in advance. So this is an area of immense opportunity. I think we have to continue advocating and thinking uniquely in our county level. In Fairfax, I've really tried through the governance committee to bring this forward. There's resistance, in different directions, and some people don't see the importance of it. But I think as minorities in education who likely haven't been seen in that way for so long, I think it's our duty to continue pushing. And I think it has to kind of come from the state or even federal levels of education to kind of mandate it in the same way that they did when we started collecting Black, Hispanic, and other categories.
Again, just to build upon what has been said, when you disaggregate the data, it reveals the hidden opportunity gap that's afflicting mostly our Southeast Asian communities and also our Asian communities suffering from poverty, living in poverty, right? The other thing is it perpetuates the model minority myth, right? It frames it in the way that, especially in school districts where they couple white and Asian data, right? It's white Asian as one group. They don't even separate in some districts. And it kind of paints this picture that Asians are like white adjacent. And it puts undue pressure on everything that you mentioned, Akil, about we have to live up to this upward mobility, stereotype. And, it puts a lot of psychological strain internally. Externally, it puts a wedge between the Asian community with our African American and Hispanic community, because it becomes a taunt that the white dominant narrative uses to say, well, one group is succeeding, let's continue with the status quo, instead of actually addressing the issues, because a racist school system cuts everyone, including whites, I would propose. Now, the student voices were so powerful, daring, I might add, and in fact, we have extracted some of those clips into some of the professional modules, which I will share later. And also in MCPS, we're conducting an anti-racist system audit. And we have used clips from those videos from the student voices to kind of give the background of why we're doing this audit. So their voices are powerful, and it hopefully is one way for us to elevate and celebrate the differences within the AAPI community.
And I think part of that made us think more about, like, how do we, education for our kids is certainly their experience, but it is a communal experience. And when it means a lot to our students when their parents and their families are embraced, welcomed, and treated with respect. And we want to figure out, how do we do that better? Part of our students are right now, all of our high schools have mental health ambassadors, where we took the load off of adults to say, wait a minute, this is not a conversation just adults should have. We should go ahead and make sure that our kids have training, voice, and ability to peer support each other, to get mental health supports when students need it. And racial identities and how that shows up has come up a lot. So that's a data point we're looking at. But again, as I reflect and hearing what my colleagues have suggested, we do, as a deputy chancellor, I could change how we collect information and what kinds of information. But right now we are grouping everyone as Asian if they choose to share it, but not breaking down the different, very different sort of groupings around that. So I think that question makes me just think more about what's possible there. I think Abrar said this should be like a federal thing. When with No Child Left Behind, we were forced to look at the data points for every groups of students. We certainly did. And now that just becomes the air we breathe, right? We don't actually do anything without differentiating around those racial groups. I wonder what might be a positive net benefit of going after and chasing that data that might be differentiated that way. I'm also wondering, for us, I think Darwin said this, the overlap between race and and social economics is a huge point for us. Looking at our data, Asian American students who are more economically stable fare fine and outperform our white peers, white students in many ways, or compete well. I think our Asian students, that's the other 50% who are not economically well, really struggle and have really challenge access that sometimes might get hidden in the aggregate. So I'm also wondering about the intersection of those and how we might not hide that by grouping them together. I'm wondering if other school districts have already started to do that, and there's something there we can learn from.
What are some of your plans as school districts, and what will you be implementing to ensure a safe environment for our children as they are coming back to school? And what are your thoughts about dealing with COVID over the next 6 months to a year?
As you cited, U.S. Census Bureau, this is, really federally, I think we need to take a different direction in tracking data by ethnicities. We could look at graduation rates, attendance rates, suspension rates, and really peel back these onion layers, as my colleagues have shared, in terms of what supports really need to be in place and for whom. The differentiated support for the whole child so that every child is a success. Going to COVID, I think, families all over are taking the precautions that they need. Our school system actually just rolled out vaccination sites over this past weekend. If anybody went to our MCPS school system's website, there actually are clinics in our schools at vaccination sites and government agencies, and there actually are schedules where we're actually picking families up at certain schools and driving them to other schools for the free vaccinations for the ages 5 to 11, I think it is. We also have rapid testing in our schools. We're still masking in our schools. We are still quarantining in our schools. We're still trying to social distance as best we can, during lunch, and thank God kids can still be outside for recess. On the buses, they're trying to keep the windows down to protect our students. And then we have some catered conversations. And so I think later on, when we get to another question, as I look at the time, we have parent community coordinators serving our highest poverty schools. And so these parent community coordinators are trying to keep in touch with all of our different ethnic populations to say, here are the resources that we have in our county and in our school system to help support your family. So I'll leave it at that for now.
And we have so many wonderful CBOs, like DC is full of assets. Asian American Lead certainly is one, but we have many other organizations that are just waiting to figure out how to lead in. And I think as much as our school leaders do such a good job just doing everything, but I think there's a particular skill set to partnering and keeping up with a partnership that like a school principal doesn't think is like, that just isn't on the top of their mind. And I've often wondered what we need to do to kind of like reimagine what public school should be, which is more integrating of community resources, which I think will be reflective of like where our national public school systems will go in the future, to carve out more of those lanes that can be shared. So I think thinking like that, I think gets to a new normal that we're creating, right? I don't think we're ever going to do school with COVID being endemic, right, the way it ever was. I think we're creating a new thing, and I don't think we create that new thing absence of parent or community voice to define what safety looks like with those social engagements and culture around teaching and learning, culture around visiting, culture around volunteering. All of those things that we took for granted once ago is something we have to renegotiate and like come to our new acceptable norms around that. And I don't think that happens in isolation without a lot of conversation.
1 in 3 AAPIs are limited English proficient. And for some populations, like the Vietnamese population, it's quite higher, it's 50%. So, this LEP status can make it difficult for students and parents to engage with school districts. Can you speak to your efforts on what is taking place to support AAPI limited English proficient students?
So in terms of Fairfax County, I mean, I think this is one of the areas where, as school divisions in general, we're just going to have to admit that we are not doing nearly enough. And it continues to blow my mind because we are thinking about where we can add and where we can, build further for all these families that we are currently communicating with. While, there's this whole world of families that have no access because of language barriers that we're not even meeting that basic minimum for. But yet we continue to invest elsewhere because I guess those are the voices closest to us. That's kind of what we've defaulted into. So it's worth imagining maybe differently, or just taking that step back and really thinking, wow, for this family, this is a horrific experience. And I haven't even been able to empathize with that, right? So that's the broad statement about language access. But, and I think that we also see kids who come in with limited English as a liability more than an asset. So, rather than seeing the rich opportunity there to invest in that language or in that culture or in that background that means so much to that family, it's more of kind of this assimilation. How are we going to get them to pass these tests? How are we going to get them to grade level to make sure that, our school stays accredited by not failing the reading SOL, et cetera. But I say that because, there are some efforts. I mean, in Fairfax, we have dual immersion, programs where we try, there's also foreign language opportunities for elementary students through this thing called, language through content, or it's a different way of exposing kids rather than just taking it as a siloed subject area. We have middle school immersion transition programs that we try to offer students. And then, of course, you have, secondary courses of all kinds of languages, like you would imagine, that kids can pick. But I mentioned those immersion programs in particular because those are an opportunity where we can start pivoting towards seeing these things as an asset, where, language for some people isn't just a nice to have in high school, right? But is an access to community, it's access to heritage and preservation of heritage. It just carries a lot more weight than just, a side subject. So those have been some of the things, we've offered. We have, with immersion in particular, we do offer it Korean, Japanese, and this goes back to kind of, how do we ensure that it's an asset and is an authentic thing? Because with Japanese, it kind of was a post World War II thing where we were trying, it's like a different motive that got us there. But regardless, that does exist. And we have, when it comes to the elementary school programming, we have things in Chinese, Japanese, Korean at a number of our schools. And then, in terms of immersion that we have, other languages that we have, we do offer, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese in high school. So there are opportunities, but, and I say them, I should say them with some pride. I mean, it is great that we offer these resources, but at the same time, I go back to my initial point where if we really put this in context and perspective and had the proper data to look at the full landscape of who we're serving and who we're not from an equity standpoint of where we're falling short, I think school systems in general have been falling tremendously short and continue to when it comes to properly, meeting what would be best practice in this area. But
yeah. We all know there's a strong correlation between quality of education that a child receives, especially early education, and the quality of their life down the road. The equity conversation, which centers on providing people with resources that fit their circumstances, is really at the center of much of school districts' efforts of late. Can you talk us through what efforts are being undertaken by FCPS to ensure that the AAPI community is being included in the education equity conversation, and what we might be able to do to help assist your work in this area?
Absolutely. This is another one where I will celebrate what we have, but say that we continue to fall short. I always like to think of it in terms of if take any identity. I mean, if a Vietnamese student came into our system and went through from K to 12 and has not read a single piece of literature or a poem or something, right, by a writer somehow connected to that identity, I see that kid has not been seen, right? That experience has not been shared and included in the broader conversation. And so that, unfortunately, is where we sit for a lot of these kids, not all, but many. perhaps most. But to speak more broadly, I mean, we have introduced a number of resources. We have kind of a AAPI resource list, in our libraries. In our online campus, we've been able to expand some of the offerings that do ensure that our AAPI families are seen in some sense, especially Korean and Chinese, in terms of what's been offered. In social studies curriculum, there has been as a part of that anti-bias work of reevaluating standards and how we teach them. There has been this introduction of the multiple perspectives initiative. We have a kind of an entire page on that includes Asian American perspectives and experiences within that. Even within our advanced academic programming, in our diverse resource kind of packages, we do have specific components on AAPI subject matter, areas of interest to the community, potentially, and obviously this is all generalization, but touch points that tap back to these identities, the heritage that folks may have coming from that background. So these are some of the pieces, of what's been introduced outside of just language. The Asian Student Association, ASA, across the county has been holding different events and addressing school issues and working with our Asian Educators Association, of course, which works in alliance with, parallel organizations along other identity groups to continue to advocate, to kind of have fora where, educators are able to come together and collaborate on best practices or their shared experiences, and having guest speakers that address some of these topics. So those are all efforts that are, I would say, budding and emerging and, continuing to push forth. But we do continue to, I think Darwin touched on this really well earlier. When we think about the broader equity conversation, do we always, have we turned Asian into too much of a white adjacent identity group that we don't necessarily associate it with the broader social justice narrative or, the equity and inclusion conversation? And have we lumped it as such a broad category that, what does that even mean when you bring it to the table of an equity and inclusion conversation? Do I bring the, the story, when I talk just about language arts curriculum, am I bringing the story of, someone who grew up in Brunei? Does that speak to the person who lives in Syria? I don't know where we even begin breaking that down, as a broader issue, but those are some of the things that are ongoing, and certainly the work continues.
Let me just start by humbly asking the AAPI community advocate again, disaggregating AAPI data by ethnic groups, major ethnic groups within the district. It is vital to the work. And then also connected to that is just more visible advocacy. As a former social studies teacher in Montgomery County, I still have faith in our democratic process, and every voice is important. And going back to what Dr. Kim said, when there's unity and strength in the coalition of voices, that's how a movement starts. So please continue to do the great work and continue to advocate. All that being said, here in Montgomery County, how have we really included the AAPI community into the equity conversation? We shared earlier with the newsletter, with the Asian American Student Voice forum. So oftentimes we collect a lot of student voice and kind of gather their lived experiences. I think a mark has been missed in many districts, including MCPS to a certain extent. What are we providing staff to do? Once we have the voice data, what are they, as the paid professional adults in the schools, what are they going to do to support these students? So we have created a professional learning series called Equity Matters Dialogue. Again, in April, we've focused on the AAPI community. Once again, we provided resources and strategies for staff, administrators to promote, celebrate, and intervene appropriately whenever there are AAPI hate incidents. The second thing that recently, and I'm very, very proud of our efforts, although once again, I wish more was done, is the valuing the celebration of Diwali in Montgomery County. Oftentimes, there are a lot of rich and very important celebrations that kind of go unnoticed. So just real quick story. We wanted to increase the cultural proficiency of our staff, of what Diwali actually is. So we partner with an MCPS parent who's also an MCPS staff member, and they shared they taped a very touching video of the importance of this very great holiday. And it was a way of, again, increasing and enriching and validating, most important, validating the lived experiences of this community. And that really brings up to the conversation. To what extent are we doing that with other AAPI communities in Montgomery County? And then last but not least, no matter how much training, professional learning we do, no matter how much voice data we get, unfortunately, hate incidents still happen. So right now there's a hyper visibility on the AAPI community as we are being scapegoated with the COVID-19 virus. But at the same time, how can we value a community when we have been traditionally invisible or ignored? And so those are things that we're, as a community, trying to have a deeper examination and maybe supplement the curriculum. So this way it would be more enriching going forward.
But because public schools are also places of education, right? And we're educating our kids. We created a racialized incident protocol because racialized incidents are predictable and reoccurring, and because they happen all sectors and all spaces in this country, of course they'll happen in schools too. And by creating a protocol that our equity team developed and tested and piloted, and now it's on all of our schools, we now have a way to address those predictably recurring incidences in a, protocol fashion, which takes some of the heat away and guides the conversation so that people can talk and hopefully learn from the situation and figure out how to make the community stronger as a result. So I think coming up with ways to kind of plan for those conversations and create these pivot moments that helps the adults and the students actually hopefully take tough conversations and become stronger as a community versus get that incident, have no idea what to do, flounder a bit, and so thus say things that might actually hurt and harm the community more. I think having ways that are predictable for us to name it, own it, and take us to a different level is really critical. And I think if we do this right, what we're doing is teaching our current adults in our school buildings skills to have those conversations, and our students to have those conversations, so that when they are like us as board members and or leading school districts, they are entering those positions with so much more skill than I know I did, walking into this. And I think that is, gives me such hope for what we're building, because I think collectively it's just, us five in this, but so many other people are saying we're not doing it that way anymore. We're going to stop that cycle of recreation, and we're going to actually create a different creation. And that's really awesome.
And Dr. Kim, on that message of hope, I think all of you have given me hope, really. And I want to thank all of you just for your commitment to our youth, all of our youth. And that's something that we do at Asian American Lead. It's just, we focus on the API community, but we're building bridges with Black and Brown communities. We're building bridges with other communities that are serving underserved populations. That's important for us. And I know that's important for all of you. So I'm honored to have hosted all of you here and to have learned from you and to grow and to think about how we can partner together moving forward. But just, I'm so excited. So I'm just thankful for all of you. Thank you so much for participating on the panel. And we will look forward to a part 2 where we can get into further details with all of this. And thank you again so much for your time.